I'm joined by Morgan Arundel, who is a Tara Yoga teacher of yoga and Archetypes of the Soul. So Morgan, can you kick us off please by telling us what does that mean, Archetypes of the Soul?
Yeah, it is somehow a notion that is perhaps a little unknown, Archetypes of the Soul, what that means. Well, first of all, we need to start off with knowing what an archetype is. And an archetype is kind of like a fundamental form or pattern. We can think of it a bit like a blueprint. And so it's a pattern of which things are based upon. Now, we are talking about archetypes of a certain part of the human being, which we refer to as the soul. And this is a part of the human being which is something more subtle than the physical body and also our personality, and is considered a more essential part of our being, a more fundamental part of our being, a part which is somehow more is closer to our fundamental nature. So archetypes of the soul implies that there would be some fundamental patterns that exist at this level, at this soul level of the human being. And that's exactly what we are going to be talking about. That indeed there are some fundamental forms or patterns that are there, and they end up expressing themselves into our personality. When we look at those patterns, they can help us understand our personality to a much greater extent. And the reason for that is that why it's so valuable is that it's looking at something more essential. You know, we can look at the personality and it has so many varied ways in which it manifests, and it's very difficult to try and understand the reason for that. But when we go back to something more essential, we're getting closer to a cause there. And so we can have a much more profound understanding as to why that certain aspect might manifest in someone's personality. So archetypes of the soul are relating to some fundamental archetypes or patterns of nature that do exist at the soul level, and they influence the way our personality is formed and expresses itself. Yeah.
Well, that sounds amazing. So if I'm on a journey of self-discovery, then archetypes sound like really important discovery for me. Is it a voyage of discovery?
Yeah, it is. And I feel its value lies in that, as a general idea, when we are looking at certain spiritual truths and trying to understand them, going to a more fundamental level is always of great importance and of value, because we get to a more objective truth there, more universal truth there. We start to look at universal ideas, universal principles, universal laws, things that apply to everyone, no matter what your beliefs or your education or your conditioning is. They apply to everyone, and that gives us a very profound way that we can relate all of our understandings. So it's something that is not just, to put it like this, it's less subjective. And by subjective I mean it's very much limited by your own individual perspective about the world, which is formed by your experiences, by your past experiences, whether good or bad, by your education and so on. And it starts becoming more objective, starts becoming more universal. And that is a kind of guiding point for us, because we have much greater chance to be guided towards something that is real and true than getting lost in our own perhaps distorted or limited understandings about the way things are. So as a general idea, looking at something like archetypes represents a very efficient way of getting to know ourselves at a deep level and providing a kind of map to that journey, to that unfolding. Yeah.
So if I'm discovering my archetypes, am I discovering what's already there, or am I aspiring towards new archetypes?
So there'll be more of an emphasis on discovering what is there already. Then the archetypes, what they also allow us to do is understand that aspect of our personality in a very fundamental way. So in this Archetypes workshop that I teach, we deal with 4 main archetypes. And those 4 main archetypes are expressions actually of the 4 main elements within the manifestation: earth, water, fire and air. And when you look at the way that that energy there as a fundamental pattern of creation supports that archetype, then you get a greater understanding as to the way that would be in a perfect or ideal case. Yeah. So how would that look? How would that particular archetype look when it's manifesting through my personality in a pure, undistorted and ideal way? Now, when we look at ourselves, there's a good chance that it's probably not doing that, because we tend to distort things, we have limited understandings of things, and that manifests as what are called the shadows of the archetypes. And they are limited or distorted views of that ideal form. So, going back to your question then, first of all, the emphasis is on discovering what's there, and then aspiring not to awaken new archetypes, but to get towards the most balanced and harmonious expression of an archetype.
Could you give me some examples of famous archetypes in history?
Yeah, well, I would say that first of all, the king archetype, for when we're talking about the masculine side, then the king archetype is quite famous, connecting it to this country we're in now. Of course, you have King Arthur and the legend there, and in many different worlds and different traditions, there's always been the legends of the great kings and leaders of huge civilizations even. So that's one of the archetypes. Also, there's again on the masculine side, the warrior archetype, and we've seen that in many different stories. And for example, the ancient samurai culture was very much aligned with that warrior kind of archetype. Yeah. Then you have on the female side, you have the fascinating woman. It's called this archetype, the one that is freely able to use her beauty and her grace and her charm to inspire and to bring energy and life and this power of the feminine creative force into the world, to inspire people. You've seen that in many different characters around the world. Yeah.
I was thinking of Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in terms of
fascinating archetype.
Female warriors, what kind of female warriors are there? I was thinking of perhaps Joan of Arc. The French call her Jeanne d'Arc, and they adore her in France.
I think she's a great example of this female heroine archetype. Yeah. Because part of that is they're not just warriors, but they have a cause. They're aligned with something. There's a purpose there. There's an ideal that they're striving towards, and that's what that particular archetype, the warrior or the hero archetype or the heroine archetype for the masculine and the feminine side, that's what it's doing. They're protecting ideals and keeping them alive for the safety of everyone. Yeah.
So when you see archetypes in the world or in movies or books or whatever, it is something that we just naturally respond to, isn't it? We have a natural desire to connect with that archetype. What's going on there? Yeah,
that's a good question, actually, because indeed we do. Unconsciously, we are connecting to certain characters in stories, and as you mentioned, in film and literature, we connect to certain characters, and very often the reason is because they are expressing one of these archetypes. Take the classic Star Wars saga. It's one of the greatest and known sagas that's ever reached the screen, I would say, because it's also a literature there as well. And part of the reason why it is so popular is because there are some classic archetypes there. Of course, the warrior, and then you have this magician or initiating type of archetype there. You have the whole hero's journey, this journey that was a very archetypal journey where a being is crossing over certain thresholds, is learning and acquiring certain skills, and is facing challenges, and then he's coming back to restore justice to the world. So I would say that when we are attracted to certain characters, that they are touching something a little bit deeper in us. And as I mentioned, we are referring to this as the soul, this part of our being, which is beyond just our personalities, beyond some superficial likes and dislikes, but it's touching something deep within us. When you're really moved by a story, really moved by a certain event that happens in a story, like perhaps there's justice there being served, and somehow that's really moving and touching, or there's something where there's a beautiful protection or nourishment by a father figure or a mother figure, and again it's very, very touching to you. So it's touching this soul level of our being. So when it happens in this very archetypal form, I would say this is what's happening, and that's why we are so attracted to those kind of stories and those characters.
So the stories of the archetypes speak to the soul in a different language, is that right?
Yes, and it's very much a language of symbols. It's a language of it's one that's not so linear there. When we get to that part of our being, it's not connected to the rational, linear thinking or the rational mind. It's much more related to our subconscious and to creativity and to things happening in a synchronized kind of way. So that's why things like story and imagination and creativity, those kind of things really speak. They're the language that really touches the soul.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
In terms of modern day, what are the archetypes that are needed most in the world today, do you think?
Oh, that's a very good question. I would think that the warrior archetype, the hero archetype, is one of the most abused of the archetypes, because part of it is as a kind of there's a healthy aggressivity that's there, like aggressiveness, a power, a force. And when that's not used, it can be very disharmoniously. It can be abused, and to the great detriment. We just look at the way the wars are being fought around the world. This is from a very unhealthy use of that heroine or hero warrior energy. So I would say that that's actually an archetype that we have too much of in its unhealthy form. So we really long for that in its healthy form. And then on the other aspect, we have, for the masculine side, we have the king archetype, and the feminine side, the mother archetype. And I think these are also lacking in our modern times as well. People who are really want to take full responsibility for their actions, and the consequence of their actions. It could be for their family or for their tribe, so to speak. And I feel like we lack that. People who are genuine leaders. So often our leaders now are more puppets just put in place to, fill temporary conditions. And there's a lot of corruption and manipulation and personal interests that go on in the leaders that we have in our modern times, rather than people who are genuinely selected for their vision and for their heart and for the care that they have for humanity and the willingness to sacrifice and so on. So I would put these two archetypes out on both the masculine and the feminine side as being very much needed in modern times.
That sounds wonderful. Morgan, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.